to earth. Do you remember? Why have we taken birth? Do you remember?
You're going to stay there, right? You're helping me on my talk. Kathy Zavada. You know, I used to get to listen to her a lot when I lived up in Seattle, because she had, I think, a brother who lived up there. I think, yeah. And so she'd always come up, and it was wonderful to listen to this music, and it was always this deep, quiet, deep chanting, wonderful, take you deep music. And now you're into this whole other, you know, little rock and roll or gospel stuff. Who says church can't be fun, right? Yeah, so thank you. And then she needs to be on. And then, so I moved to Clarkston, Washington, which is kind of the armpit of Washington. Are we recording this? Did I actually say that with my out loud voice? It's a long ways from Seattle in so many ways, not just physically. But, and so I thought, well, I'm never going to hear Kathy again. And then one day, a few years ago, somebody said, hey, there's this singer named Kathy Zavada who's going to be up in, I think they mispronounced your name badly too, who's going to be up in Moscow, Idaho, which is about half an hour, 45 minutes north of us. And it's like, oh my God, she's going to be in Moscow, Idaho? And so it turned out that somebody had won a concert on, I think, your GoFundMe site when you were funding your latest CD, and won a house concert, and decided instead of doing a house concert, they would do a church concert at the Unitarian Church up there. And so I grabbed about 4 of my congregation and said, you got to go listen to this person, we got to go chant. And so I had a wonderful evening and chanting in Moscow, Idaho, your first time ever in that region, you know, and last time too, I think, since then. Yeah, so thank you. It's great. I want to make one more announcement that I realized didn't get into the announcements, and that is that this evening there's a drumming circle here from 6 to 7 o'clock that Reverend Lynn Fritz leads, and for some reason I don't think it was in the announcements, but if you like to drum, and you don't have a drum, she has percussive instruments, come and join us. So let's take a breath. This is the last Sunday I wasn't here in the liturgical calendar last year. And I love this Sunday because it's one of those, it's a schizophrenic calendar for New Thought ministers, because we can either talk about Palm Sunday, which is today in the Christian calendar, or we can talk about Passover, which comes this week. In this case, it's beginning this Friday evening in the Hebrew calendar, the Jewish calendar. And they're both such rich, you know, laden with meaning, and oftentimes laden with misunderstanding processes to use. So this year we're going to do Passover. Next year we're going to do Palm Sunday. We good? So you all have to come back next year. So we're going to take a look at Passover. And Passover commemorates the liberation from slavery in Egypt. It's the commemoration of that time that the Israelites moved from Egypt to the Promised Land. Most of you have heard about this, right? Yes, a few of you have. Okay, good. The rest of you, there's this book called the Bible. You may have heard of that one. And there's some fun stories in that one. So we're going to look today at the Exodus story. And the Exodus story has been a cause of concern for some people, because if you read it on a literal basis, it looks like God is a pretty nasty, cruel, mean, vicious little, thing, right? Which isn't really true, but we're going to talk about that in a moment. We're going to talk about the metaphysical view of this story and taking a look at that, what's really being communicated. So the first thing to understand about the Passover story and this whole migration from Egypt to the Promised Land is this story never happened. This is not a factual story. Take a breath. See, Egypt was a pretty sophisticated civilization in its day. It had people who were recording the history long before the Jewish people were there and long after the Jewish people were there. Okay? And if you had 10 plagues, the last of which would have been the killing off of all the firstborn children and animals of the place. If you'd had a mass exodus of all your slaves leaving, and if you'd had the Pharaoh's army die, in the river, the Red Sea, wouldn't that have made the evening news? One would think. Unless there's a mass cover-up going on, but they didn't do cover-ups quite in the same way as we do today. But it never made history. There's no record of it. Not only that, but the town of Jericho, where they had, the walls come tumbling down in Jericho and all that stuff. Jericho was a city that was ancient, thousands of years old, and it would rise and be occupied and thrive for several hundred years, and then it would be abandoned and let go for several hundred years, and then it would be arise and be occupied and thrive again for several hundred years, and it had a cycle going like that. And in the time for several hundred years around either time of the biblical date of this happening, it was empty. There wasn't anybody there to conquer. Okay, so we look at the linear stuff of this, and as I like to say, no Egyptians and no Canaanites were hurt or harmed in the making of this story. Okay? It didn't physically happen. It didn't in a linear way happen. However, it's a powerful, powerful story. It's the foundational story of the Jewish people. And just like Genesis also didn't happen the way that it is written, it's not a linear thing, factual thing. I'm sorry if some of you are disappointed in that, but Adam and Eve really didn't quite happen the way it is. The real story of Adam and Eve is that Eve was wandering around the garden saying, God, I'm bored and lonely, and it's a beautiful place, but I'm kind of tired of eating apples all the time and stuff like that. Do you have anything, something I can do? And God said, well, I could make a man. And Eve said, what's a man? And God said, well, he's somebody with aggressive tendencies and kind of arrogant sometimes and a little pushy and stuff like that and loves football. And but he can lift heavy objects and he can hunt down animals for you to vary your diet, and he's pretty fun in bed. And so Eve says, this sounds good. Let's take a man. And God says, oh, there's one more thing. He's going to want to believe that I made him first. And that's how the Genesis story came to be the way we know it. The fundamentalist Christians are going to be sending me letters now. So we're going to take this story, first of all, and we're going to walk through it with a little musical help from Kathy to just kind of get the story, to set the tone for those of you who are not familiar with the story and get an idea of how it's written out and how it sounds. And we're going to do this, I have to say, at a fairly high level, because there's tons and tons and tons of symbology in this story. I could spend probably a 6 to 8 week class just going through the symbology and what it means in this story, but we're just going to take a real high view of it. So at the end of Genesis, at the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph has been in charge, or the second in command of Egypt. He's done, saved his family and Egypt from the famine and stuff like that. His whole family, which is the 12 sons of Jacob, who's also known as Israel, who was the start of the Israelites. They're the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. They've all moved to Egypt. And they're all happy. Life is good. They're living happily ever after. Yes. Life is good. And then you turn the page. And you come to the book of Exodus. First chapter, verse 8, of the book of Exodus. Now there rose up a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And with those words, you know that trouble is a brewing for the Israelites. And this is a fear-based king. He's worried about the fact that if they ever go to war, the Israelites might stay home and might take over the whole place. Can you say paranoid? Paranoid. And so he does wonderful political doublespeak. I love this line out of the Bible. Come, let us deal wisely with them before they multiply. There's been other political leaders who have been doing that doublespeak, right? So he begins to oppress them and oppress them more and more. And finally he orders, but they keep on multiplying. You know how those Israelites are. They keep on multiplying. And so he finally orders the killing of all the firstborn, of all the babies who are being born, male babies. So along comes a situation, an awkward situation, because there is a baby born, and his mother hides him for 3 months. Finally can't figure out what to do with him, how to hide him anymore. So she builds a little ark, puts him in the ark, floats him down the river, and he lands in the reeds. The Pharaoh's daughter finds him, names him Moses. You've heard of Moses, right? Okay, good. Found by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised in that way. And Moses is our hero. Do we have a hero music? So Moses grows up. There's a lot to that story, Moses growing up, but Moses grows up. Eventually he walks by this particular burning bush, notices this bush is burning but not being consumed, goes over and investigates it, and gets called by the angel, and then finally God, who says, I want you to represent me and to support my people getting out of Egypt. I want you to represent me to the Pharaoh. And Moses says what? No thanks. You don't want me. I stutter. I'm not eloquent. I'm wanted for murder, actually. You want my brother Aaron. By the way, if all the other babies were slaughtered, how does he have a brother Aaron? But anyways, this is also how you know this is not a true story. There's all these different little inconsistencies. That was the word I was looking for. Thank you so much. In this story. You want my brother Aaron, and God says, no, I want you. And so he finally says, okay, yes, I will stand up to Pharaoh. I will take this on. And my talk is completely out of order up here. And so he decides to take on Pharaoh. He stands up to Pharaoh, says, let my people go. We can do a Paul Robeson voice here. Let my people go. You know, and so I will not be singing at the next service. And so God sends 9 plagues. And you also know this is a setup because it also says God has him doing this, and God meanwhile says, and by the way, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so he won't. Okay, yeah. So nine plagues, each one worse than the other. They're all highly symbolic of what they mean. And finally he hits the 10th plague. And the 10th plague is that he's going to kill off all the firstborn children of every person and animal in Egypt. Not sure about the animals. And this, by the way, is how we get Passover. Passover is that period where God gave very specific instructions to the Israelites and said, you know, sacrifice a lamb, scatter the blood of the lamb on your door, and I will know that that's a symbol that you're one of my chosen people, and I will pass over your door as I'm killing everybody else. Thus we get the Passover celebration, thus we get the Seder meal, and the whole bit of that celebration, from that. So that's where Passover originally starts. So that's funny enough that Pharaoh changes his mind. He says, yes, get out of here. I've had enough of this. And so they leave, they head for the Red Sea, and then, of course, Pharaoh famously does what? Changes his mind, comes on after them, and so Moses parts the Red Sea. Do we have any parting the Red Sea music? No? It's okay. No, okay. Whatever tune moves into your head, parts the Red Sea. And of course, the children of Israel move through. The Egyptian army follows them. The Red Sea comes back, drowns them all, and they're done. And so now they're out in the Promised Land. That, by the way, is the end of the Passover week. Passover is a 7-day celebration, and it follows through the Torah each and every week, or each and every day, and it talks about different things, and it finally ends with the escape from Egypt and passing the Red Sea. But there's more to the story, right? So we're going to also look at the more to the story. So now they've arrived outside of the Red Sea, but they're in the desert. Got any desert music for me?
Midnight at the oasis. Send no camel to bed.
Yes. So we're out in the desert. The people are restless. Man, you left us out here to die. We would have been better off back in Egypt and all that stuff. They get to the promised land within about 6 weeks or so of the time that they left. And Moses decides to send in some scouts to go see what's happening in the promised land. You know, how is it looking, and check it out and stuff like that. Out of the, I think he sent in 40, if I remember my numbers right. He sends in 40, 38 of them come back and say, oh my God, it's got people with cell phones ringing, and it's got giants, and it's got, playing with you, Joanne, and it's got all sorts of stuff happening in there, and it's scary territory. 2 of them come back carrying big piles of big grapes and all sorts of stuff like that, and say, this land is fabulous. Okay? One of those 2 people, you're going to want to know this name because he comes up later on, it's named Joshua. Okay? Carries the stuff back. What happens is the people decide that they can't move in yet. They're not going to go. They don't trust God. Moses is trying to say, hey, God's with our armies. Just don't sweat it. We're good. And they're like, we're not going to trust that. We're and like that. So what the short story is that they get sent off to wander in the desert for 40 more years. Wandering, wandering, wandering. The real truth is that Moses, being a guy, doesn't ask for directions. I should have probably saved this for Mother's Day when we could make Mother's Day jokes. And on Father's Day, I'll do some where the men look good jokes, okay? Or maybe not. We'll just leave that alone. Eventually, they get to the Promised Land. They get to the Promised Land. Moses dies. Before they can get into the Promised Land, he can't lead them into the Promised Land. Joshua, remember Joshua? Joshua is the general by now who leads them into the Promised Land. And he conquers Jericho with this horn-blowing ceremony that I've been still trying to figure out what all that means. The symbology of it, the walking around 7 times, blowing the horns, everybody marches around behind them being silent and stuff like that. There's got to be some great metaphysical meaning to it. I don't know what it is yet. But someday we'll figure that out. Anyways, and then he goes on, and God orders him to kill every man, woman, child, and animal that's already occupying the land. It sounds like genocide to me, okay? And this is one of the places where people get into, well, God, what kind of a God would ask us to do that? Okay? So take a breath. Did we have Arriving at the Promised Land music? I forgot. Yes. All right, thank you. So, thank you, Kathy. What does this really mean? What is this story really about? Let's take a look at the metaphysics of it and unpack it that way and see what we can come to understand, because we know it's not factual. We know it's not real. So first of all, it's a map to freedom. All the old stories of the Old Testament are stories that guide us into how to live life well. They're often stories of how to be creative, how to do different things. This is the idea of how to move from bondage to freedom. How many of you in your lives have ever experienced bondage in some way or another somewhere in your life? And no, I'm not talking about that kind of bondage. I'm talking about where you're feeling stuck and trapped and you want to get free. Most of you? Okay? So this is a roadmap for how to do that. This is a conversation about how to do that, about how to move from bondage to freedom. So the Israelites represent our consciousness. The Israelites are our consciousness as it evolves. Throughout the Bible, if you read it, it's the evolving story of the consciousness of this people. They are us. And so the first thing to recognize in the bondage story, in this story, is we started off with a good thing. And good things eventually no longer work for us. Have you ever noticed? How many of you have been in a relationship, a job, a house, something where it was once really good and suddenly a new king arises, right? And it's not so good anymore. A couple of you have. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, more people have. Lots of us have had that experience. So everything changes. This is a reminder that stuff changes. This is a reminder that just as we grow, we don't fit into things anymore. I've got a little baby about that age that right now, Oliver, and he's not fitting into the same clothes that he used to fit into. He's not fitting into the same patterns they used to fit into. All of us are growing constantly, and we don't fit into the same old stuff. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing bad about it, but we don't fit. And so the Israelites no longer belonged in Egypt. They no longer belonged in Egypt. Now, the thing is, how many of you love change? Couple? Me too, kind of. Excepting where I don't want to. Right? We all love change excepting where we don't want to. The Pharaoh represents that aspect of us that is resistance to change. I'm going to hang on to this situation until you peel my cold, dead fingers off of this situation. I'm going to hang on to this relationship. I'm going to hang on to this job. I'm going to hang on to this house. I'm going to hang on to this not working thing, my love of desserts, until you peel my cold, dead fingers off of them. Okay? Anybody have a little bit of that going within them besides me? Good, okay. So that's what the Pharaoh represents. It's the unwillingness to change. Moses, of course, is our hero self. Moses is that aspect of us that hears, listens to, and says yes to, not always directly, but yes to the call within. See, Moses walks by the burning bush. Most of us today would walk by a burning bush, look at that, and say, I don't want to get involved with that. Not me, Moses gets curious. He walks over to the bush and says, hey, what's happening here? Okay? There's that aspect of us which says, I hear the call, and I'm going to go and check it out. Most of us hear the call. That was good timing. Most of us hear the call. Thank you, whoever did that. But we don't want to answer the call. We're afraid of answering the call. We were stuck in answering the call. Okay? And so the rest of us can turn our cell phones to silent. That'll be fabulous. The thing to remember about Moses is he's not perfect. He comes to, God comes to him and he says, you don't want me. You want my brother Aaron. He's the golden kid. I stutter, wanted for murder, I guess, all this stuff. You don't want me. Okay? How many of you have this idea that in order to create the change that you want, in order to move into your promised land, everything has to be perfect before you move? Okay? All the ducks have to be lined up. The stars have to be in the right position. The economy has to be just right. You have to know just the right people, have just the right connections, and have it all lined out ahead of time. And Moses is here to remind us that, no, we don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just need to get off our duff and start moving. Because Moses finally says yes to God. He says, yeah, I'll do this. I don't like it. I'm resistant to it. But yes, I'm going to do it. He listens to and he answers the call. So secondly, the second thing that I want to talk about that we move into then is this Passover idea itself, the killing of the firstborn. Boy, that sounds like a loving, gentle God, doesn't it? He's going to kill off all the firstborn children of all the Egyptians and their animals. What did the animals do? Okay? What is this really about? So again, we go back to the metaphor, the metaphysics of it. The Egyptians represent our bondage thoughts. The Egyptians represent that which holds us in bondage. And what really holds us in bondage? Is it the outer circumstances? No, it's our inner circumstances. It's our stinking thinking that holds us in bondage wherever we are. Okay? The firstborn is the originating thoughts. It's the thoughts that continue the lineage of all the thinking down and on further. So rather than dealing, I have a metaphor that I love to use with people, that rather than, if you're stuck with a bunch of negativity, rather than dealing up in the twigs of the tree, you go down to the roots of the tree and you take the whole thing out by the roots. So it can't keep on growing new twigs and new branches and new stuff. You take it out by the roots. You get down to the root cause. That's where when we go into foundations class and we look at what we call core beliefs. What are these core beliefs, and get to those, because they're the ones that are creating all the other stuff. And when you deal with and release a core belief, a firstborn, you take care of everything that's going to come after that. It doesn't produce anything more. So this is the consciousness of, in order to move from our old stuck space, we have to release and stop the thinking that got us in the old space. Because the reason we're in the bondage space is because we have what kind of consciousness? If we're in bondage, what kind of consciousness do we have? Bondage consciousness, right? Are you with me? Okay. The consciousness that gets us into the relationships that we don't like means that we expect the kind of relationships that we don't like. You know, if we're going to shift our relationships, if we have high drama relationships, if that's our norm since we've grown up, the minute you step into a new relationship that's not high drama, it's boring. What's going on? We don't know how to exist in it, okay? We'll talk about that in a minute. But we have to get rid of the old thinking, and we have to get rid of that which keeps on generating the thoughts. So that is the idea of killing off the firstborn. Remember, this is a roadmap of how to get out of bondage. Okay? Next we come to the Red Sea. The Red Sea is what we would call today between a rock and a hard place. Okay? You're stuck with an impassable situation, and you got your old past bearing down on you. And it keeps on calling to you and calling to you. And you want to break free of it, but the same kind of jobs that you've always had keep on calling to you. The same kind of relationship partners you've always had keep on calling to you. You know, or maybe you call them. You know? And it keeps on going and going and going. And what the Red Sea is about is when we finally listen to the voice within that's tapped into infinite power, that's tapped into something that isn't stuck in bondage consciousness, we can have a parting of the Red Sea. We can have what doesn't look logical to the intellect, but what the soul knows as its true path emerges. We have a soul path that is laid out from us, in front of us. And the other thing about this soul path is the old stinking thinking can't follow through that path. It can't come with us. That's one of the things to realize is we can't keep the stinking thinking as we move out of the old process. And so the army of old stinking thinking gets swamped by this process. Are you with me? Okay? So we're moving out of that. We're moving out of bondage. We're moving out of that process. The old ways can't stick with us. And so we enter a new phase. You know, the way is made possible. Where there needs to be a way, the way is made possible. And then we get to the wandering in the desert phase. I think it was Ilyana von Zandt that wrote a fabulous book called In the Meantime. You know, and most of us don't like meantime consciousness, do we? We're sitting kind of in between here and there. You know, it's like, you know, you're between the two trapezes, you let go of one trapeze, and the other one hasn't shown up yet, and you're stuck in midair going, God, I hope there's a trapeze there. God, I hope there's a trapeze there. Okay? Or at least a safety net down below me. So we're stuck in that place of in between, and we have a tendency in our consciousness, like the Israelites, to start complaining. It was better back where we were. There's some, if you read this particular section, there's some great complaints. You know, you've let us out here to die in the desert. We were more comfortable in our beds back there. At least we had a meal. We knew where it was coming from, and all this stuff. And this is where, you know, the past looks really good. You know, that old job, it really wasn't so bad. Yeah. That old girlfriend, boyfriend, you know, maybe I'll call them up again. They weren't so bad. Yeah? Yes, they were, but as you're sitting out there going, yeah, but it's better than being lonely here all night long, you know, or better than being on unemployment or whatever as I'm moving my way to my promised land. You know, we have this tendency to want to go back. What's important at this time is that we don't. What's important is we stay where we are. What's important also is we recognize that we are supported along the path. Remember that they had manna from heaven. They had a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to guide them. They had these reassurances. Now, it's not living in the promised land. Okay? It ain't milk and honey, it's manna. But it's enough to get by. And most of us, especially in this land of where we want, you know, instant gratification, I want to be able to travel straight from Egypt straight to the promised land right now. And if I can't get there in 5 seconds, what in my consciousness is in the way? Okay? We can't do that. It takes time. And here's why. Because eventually, within about 6 weeks, as we said, they arrive early. They arrive at their promised land. We all can get to our promised land sometimes quite early, quite quickly. But we don't have the consciousness to live there. That's why all the people saw the problems with the promised land, the giants, the armies, all that stuff. And so that's what we get caught up in. That's all we can see. We get to the promised land, we get to the new job, and it doesn't feel right. We get to the new relationship, and it doesn't feel right. And so we can't live there, we can't stay there, because we're not ready to occupy the land yet in our consciousness. Our consciousness has to shift, and it takes the time to shift from bondage consciousness to promised land consciousness. Ernest Holmes describes spiritual mind treatment as the time and process to change our consciousness. And sometimes that can happen quickly, and sometimes if it's a big wrestling match that we've been stuck in for a lot of years, it can take a while to get that process going. Doesn't mean we're bad, doesn't mean anything's wrong with us, it just takes process to do and time. So we arrive early, we don't have the consciousness to stay there, and so we have to wander until the old consciousness dies off. That's the generation, that's the 40 years, that represents the old consciousness dying off. I mean, we even talk about that in some of our stuff today, that I think it's been, so many scientific discoveries have been made and become, more accepted when the old scientists who say that's not the way it was, die off, right? I even heard somebody recently say that about the change or the merging between our two, international and united cultures. Is it's going to take a while for those who are seriously resistant to that to literally die off before we can actually have this and a whole new generation of religious scientists who didn't have separation consciousness take over. And so that's the kind of consciousness that we're going for, is we have to let the old consciousness die off. Now, depending on how quickly we are, or how good we are at letting that happen, is how quickly we move into our promised land. Along the path here, we get guidance. Moses goes up the mountain, gets the 10 suggestions, the 10 words is what the Jewish word, the Hebrew word means. We translate it as commandments, like you have to do this, but they're more the suggestions, they're the guidance. We get a process of guidance. We start saying, you know what, there's a process that works, and I'm going to stick with it. I'm not going to worship false gods anymore, which dissipate my energy. I'm going to stay with this program. If I'm training physically, I'm going to stay with this training program physically. I'm not going to wander around. This week I'm going to do yoga, next week I'm going to do Tai Chi, next week I'm going to do Pilates, next week I'm going to do something else, and for a week I'll work out at the gym, and then I'll quit that, and then, we don't do that because that doesn't work. Does that work, Willie? Willie, does that work? No. That's all right. Putting you on the spot. My trainer over here. You have to stick with something that works. And so we stop being seekers, and we become finders. We say, you know what, this is a plan, this is a process, this is a program that works, and I'm going to stick with it. And when we do that, what happens is we start to be ready to move into the promised land. So Moses dies. Why does Moses die? Because Moses is the consciousness that got us out of bondage and seeking, but he's not the consciousness of moving into. Who's the consciousness in this story moving into? Joshua. Joshua's been there, thought it was great. He's already moved into the promised land in his mind. I make a joke that I talked about in the first service, that when the International Centers for Spiritual Living and the United Centers for Spiritual Living were first in the process of coming together, the first group that got it, the first group that moved into that promised land was our youth. They combined their bank accounts, they threw it all together, they said, hey, we're just, together. In fact, they decided to switch from calling it ICSL and UCSL to We CSL. Instead of an I and a U, it was we. And they got it. They moved into the promised land, long before the adults could do it. Some of the adults still haven't done it, as Mary knows. So you have to have that consciousness that is already moving into and already living in the promised land. Mary Morrissey in the Prosperity Plus class talks about we have to be already in our good, living our good, experiencing our good in our consciousness before we can actually start to experience it with our bodies and our physicality. We plant our consciousness into the promised land that we want and allow our bodies and the rest of us to catch up with that consciousness. And that's what takes the time. That's the wandering in the desert. So it's a case of we can't get there from here as long as we're here. We have to be there in consciousness. And finally, we get to that wonderful little process. Kill everything that's in the promised land. Destroy all the cities, all that stuff. Again, sweet sounding God, right? Never happened. No Canaanites were harmed in the making of this story. What this is about is that in the Promised Land, if we want to have a direct experience with our Promised Land, we have to get rid of everything in our consciousness that blocks the direct experience of the Promised Land. We cannot bring old stuff with us, and we cannot have the stuff that's already, maybe there in our idea of what was the Promised Land like. Because we all have ideas. We all have ideas of what our ideal relationship or job or whatever looks like. And sometimes we have to move and let go of even those cherished ideas and open up, because the infinite has a bigger idea than we do. Have you noticed? Besides, yes. The infinite has a bigger and better idea than we do. I love Michael Beckwith has a phrase that says, I accept more good than I've ever even imagined before. We have to get our own limited thinking out of the way. Can we have a direct experience with the Promised Land? And so once again, we have to sweep clear everything that's in the way of that so we can have this direct experience. What this says is this process of moving from bondage to freedom takes a couple places of being ruthless with ourselves, where we have to truly, truly get rid of that which no longer serves us. The question comes up, do I really want to, can I really hang on to this favorite little belief system? Right now I'm working on changing my diet, and can I really still visit the sweet spot every day and have a little dessert? It's such a nice thing to do, and that chocolate mousse and those chocolate tarts are so good. I can't do that. Reverend Sue went through I brought her my lab results from the recent, test, and she went through that and says, well, the good news is you're not going to die right away, but the bad news is that if you don't change your diet, you are. And so, that wasn't quite how she put it at all, but and I'm not that close, don't worry, please. But we all know that if we don't change something, the universe will send a 2x4, and after the 2x4 comes the Mack truck, and after the Mack truck comes the locomotive, So we want to probably start, at least at the 2x4 stage. The feather stage is even better, but the 2x4 at least pay attention to. So we can't move into our Promised Land with old thoughts of how it should be. We have to be able to move into the Promised Land and then directly experience it for what it is. Okay? We move into new relationships. Can we directly experience this person and ourselves as who we are, or do we carry old baggage from the old relationship? And so it's a case of being ruthless. You know what? I'm not carrying this forward. I am not carrying this forward anymore because I choose to create something new and I choose to live in freedom. So this is the process of moving from bondage to freedom. Have you noticed it's not necessarily an easy process? Have you noticed that it takes some work and some discipline and some ruthlessness? And yet, it's worth it to move into the land of milk and honey. See, in the story, Joshua doesn't quite kill off everybody in the Promised Land. There's a couple of little groups that bargain with him, and one that deceives him outright. Okay? And he lets them live. And if you read later into the Bible, those groups come back to haunt him and come back to haunt the Jewish people. Okay? We have to get rid of all of it. So this week, your homework. 4 things, okay? I've let you off light the last couple of weeks. We've only done 1 or 2. This week, 4. Number 1, notice where do you feel in bondage? Where in your life, bless you, are you feeling in bondage? What have you outgrown? It may have once worked well, but what have you outgrown? What are you ready to say, you know what? I'm not going to let this limit me anymore. I'm moving out, I'm expressing, I'm expanding from this. Number 2, begin to listen to the voice within about that subject. This could look like visioning. This could look like just simply listening to that which you know. I've known for quite a while that I needed to do more exercise and less eating chocolate, but I haven't really listened to that voice. I heard it. It's been babbling back there for years, but I haven't said yes to it. So start to listen to it. Start to pay attention to that voice. Let it guide you out of the old and into the new, and then trust the journey. Trust the journey. Because if you say, yes, I'm leaving my Egypt, you will have a journey. And it won't always be comfortable. Sorry. Number 3, be ruthless with your stinking thinking. Excise it. Get it out of there. These are false gods and energy dissipation that you don't need in your life anymore. Be ruthless with it. Cut it out. Do a stinking thinkinectomy. Is that a good medical process? And get it out. And then finally, number 4, develop the consciousness to fully move into your promised land. Start to know what your promised land looks like and start to move into it in your consciousness to whatever degree you can. You may not know all the details of it, but you at least know the feeling of it. Okay? And let nothing stand in the way of that direct experience. Don't leave anything in the way. So 4 things. Notice where you're in bondage, listen to the voice within, be ruthless with your stinking thinking, and develop the consciousness that lives in your promised land. Are you willing to do that this week? Yes. Cool. Did I hear a no? Yes. I'm going to close with a quote from Annie DiFranco. Nobody laughs. Who's a singer. This is a lyric from one of her songs. This lyric is wonderful. It says, "They say the truth will set you free, but then again, so will a lie. It depends if you're trying to get to the promised land or if you're just trying to get by." The truth will set you free. The lies are what we tell ourselves to just get by. So this week, stand in that truth. Stand powerfully in that truth. And be the highest and best Moses consciousness, Joshua consciousness that you can be. Let's pray. We'll have a little music under the prayer. So I know that there is one infinite presence, and it is love. There is nothing about that presence that would hurt or destroy anything, because all of creation is an expression of the divine. There's no need for the divine to kill off cruelly any aspect of itself, because that infinite presence is pure love, pure good. And so as we breathe that in, as we rest in that, as we become aware of that infinite love in which we live, move, and have our being, of that absolute freedom that is the nature of this universe, that as Ernest Holmes reminds us is our nature. We recognize that it's our nature because we are one of this infinite presence. If the presence is infinite, there is nowhere to be but within that presence. There is nothing outside of that infinite unity. There's only that which is within. And so we ourselves are within that wonderful love. We ourselves are within that one life. We ourselves are within and expressions of that freedom. This is our true nature, whether we remember it and accept it or not. Whether we're living in Egypt or whether we're living in the Promised Land, we still are one of the infinite presence of God. And so I speak my word, knowing that this word is creative, knowing that this word is creative by the power of the infinite moving through me, that each of us here today opens to this good, opens to our freedom, opens to our true Promised Land consciousness in greater and greater ways. That we take this idea of passing over from bondage into freedom, and we live it, we walk it, we let it be our path. So we no longer feel stuck. So we no longer feel confined. So we can breathe fully. We can love fully. We can create fully. We can be alive fully. Because this is our true nature. We are created in the image and likeness of the One. And so we simply say yes to this good today in the most fabulous, most wonderful ways possible. And out of that yes comes a blessing that blesses everything and everyone around us. And so for this blessing, I'm grateful. For each of us and how good it becomes for us, and for the blessing that we share out beyond us, I'm ever so grateful. For the Spirit within it all, I am grateful. And so I release this word, I plant this word as a seed into the law, the grounding of the law, the process, the true nature of law, and allow it to blossom forth in each and every life who hears this idea, who grasps this idea, and says yes to this idea. So it is the law that does the work. We are simply willing We are open to this idea. We are open to the idea of our freedom in greater and greater ways. We may not know how that works. We don't have to. We say yes to the divine, and it makes the way possible. It parts whatever Red Seas are in front of us and makes the way possible. And so we let it go, we let it be, knowing it is already done in consciousness and must follow in physical form. And so it does. And together we say, and so it is. Thank you.